Hey guys, it's Reynad back with part 2 of my Grand 20 set review, and a million cards have come out since part 1, so I think what I'm going to do is take the cards that have been revealed since then, chop it up into 2 videos, and present it to you guys that way. So I'm going to go through it class by class. We're going to start with Druid, and a lot of exciting cards here. So to start things off, we have Druid of the Saber, which is a 2-mana 2/1 with Charge and Stealth, and this is kind of an interesting like choose mechanic because it's actually a pretty big difference. Like nobody thinks that like Bluegill Warrior, whatever the Murloc with Charge is called, nobody thinks that that card is like overpowered or even playable in most decks. And you know, a 2-mana 3/2 stealth also, it's fine as a 2-drop, but nobody thinks that's overpowered. But like that doesn't make the card bad. The fact that you get the choice of these two different types of stats gives it so much flexibility, and even though each half of it isn't that strong of a card on its own, in this case, like the choice mechanic just gives it so much extra value. I mean, if you don't have a Wrath and you're behind on board, the Charge gives you like a, an additional removal spell. It can kill your opponent out of nowhere with Savage Roar, just give you a little bit more reach. If you don't draw Wild Growth, though, you're not forced to play this like 2/1 Charge like with Bluegill Warrior. You can have a solid 3/2 Stealth minion, which is pretty good. I mean, Gilbin Stalker's a fine card. We've seen it in Constructed, so I actually think Druid of the Saber would see play. The only question is whether there's room for it in a Druid deck, because it's definitely like good enough. The question is, with all the new Druid cards coming out, are you going to have space for another 2-mana card like this? And I think not, because one of the other 2-drops in here might be the best 2-mana card in the game. Alright, so moving on, we have Savage Combatant, which is 4-mana 5/4 Inspire. You give your hero +2 attack this turn. I mean, it makes your hero powers pretty good, but in a traditional Druid deck where you're trying to play like a Piloted Shredder on turn 3 off of Wild Growth, you want to keep curving, playing 5-drops the turn after. So I actually don't see Savage Combatant as being very good. I don't think it'll ever see play. First of all, the stats just suck. Like anything that stacks up that badly to Shredder, Deathbite, and True Silver Champion is just not going to see play. And those cards are not going away anytime soon. I don't think they'll ever make a 4-drop as strong as Piloted Shredder. Like Blizzard was fully aware that that card was somewhat of a mistake and overpowered in the set. So basically what I'm saying is a 4-drop lines up poorly to Piloted Shredder in almost any metagame moving forward. It's going to be pretty weak. The thing that sucks about it is you want to be curving out with a Druid deck, or really any deck. So you don't want to be taking time to use your hero power. If you're in a really late game situation and you play Savage Combatant, then yeah, if it lives for several turns, its hero power is going to do a lot, but realistically, you have to look at it like a 6-mana card. It's kind of like Fire Elemental in that regard, which is a pretty good card. I mean, maybe it's better than I'm giving it credit for. I know that in a standard Druid deck where you're trying to just curve out, it does not seem strong, though. But if you play it on turn 6, it's actually pretty good against Piloted Shredder. So it's not completely unplayable. I just don't think there's going to be room for a card like this. Moving on to Aviana. This is like the new Druid Legendary. It's a 9-mana 5/5, and your minions cost 1. So it's tough to get immediate value out of it. You have to have 10 mana or an Innervate in your hand, plus creatures in your hand. And later in the game, you're not usually, how do I put it? Like if I have 9 mana, enough to play this thing, I'm not really hurting on mana. I don't need more. You're usually wanting more cards in hand at that point. So I feel like it's in some sort of weird like combo-oriented or really slow controlling Druid deck. This could be really strong. But to me, it just feels a little bit underpowered unless the metagame becomes very slow. And even then, you have to be careful not to overextend into cards like Brawl. So personally, I don't think it'll see too much play, but it's there's so many things changing in this set that it's really impossible to say whether a card will see play or not, because until we see every card revealed, I can only evaluate by like how good cards are if they were to exist in the game right now. And right now, if Aviana was in the game, it just wouldn't really see much play, I think. But that might change. There's a lot of good anti-control tools that have been revealed, and if the metagame becomes really slow, I could see a card like this being good. Next, I'm going to move on to probably like the best card I want to say that's been released for the set so far, which is Darnassus Aspirant. It's between this and Lock and Load so far for the best cards, I think, because this is really not okay as a card. Like, how do I put it? It's better than Wild Growth against Zoo, and you're not like, okay, I want to say like at least half the time you're not going to get to use your extra mana crystal, but the fact that it's like a 2-mana 2/3, which is totally fine in and of itself, that they're forced to kill, like, it's like Undertaker, you know, like if you don't deal with it immediately, you lose the game. And it's a lot of what Darnassus Aspirant kind of feels like to me. Like, I'm gonna play it, even if they have a shield and mini bot, they can't deal anything. They can't deal with it. And like, if you get to actually use your crystal the next turn, it's not like it stops having taunt. Like, they still have to kill it. So the cards seem, I mean, 100% it'll see play, I'm pretty sure, in every single Druid deck. I think it might just be the best 2-mana card in the game, honestly, at least as far as minions go. I don't really know what they were thinking with it, because unless it's actually a lot worse than I'm giving it credit for, I see this as just being like a broken Druid card, honestly. It just seems way too good to me. So, I mean, we'll see, you know. If you get it off a Piloted Shredder, yeah, it'll blow up your mana crystal. I'm not really going to talk about all the corner cases where you can get this card off of other cards like Piloted Shredder, because you know, it happens with like every spell in the set. You can argue it makes like Nexus Champion Sarad worse, stuff like that. It's not really a huge deal that you can get this off Piloted Shredder. Yeah, mostly though, I think Darnassus Aspirant is probably the best. I hope it's the best Druid card in the set, because if there's something better than this, that's like really scary, honestly. The card just seems very, very good to me. Moving on to Brave Archer. It's a 1-mana 2/1. Inspire. If your hand is empty, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. So now that there's like 2 of these cards, Quick Shot and Brave Archer, that encourage you to have an empty hand, I might see a Hunter deck that's more along those lines. And in face Hunter decks, the question is Brave Archer better or worse than Worgen Infiltrator? And it might be better, for all I know. I'm not really sure. It's kind of weird, because if you draw it ever, you want to just throw it out of your hand to empty your hand, but you know, then you're not going to be getting the value off of it. Realistically, it's like Leper Gnome, except much, much harder to get the extra 2 damage. You can only get that extra 2 damage late game, and you know, it's not going to live twice, so you're never going to inspire twice off of it. So I think that Brave Archer, like, most likely it's not going to be good enough even for Face Hunter, but there's a small chance that the deck really wants to just go all in, and there's some kind of version of the deck like that in which this would be playable. But it's definitely, like, it's not amazing, but it's costed aggressively enough that it's like almost good enough. So let's see. Moving on, we have I think it's the only Hunter card that's been released so far since the last review. Moving on to Mage, though, we've got Spellslinger, which is a pretty cool card. 3-mana 3/4, Battlecry, add a random spell card to each player's hand. I feel like Spellslinger, like, the stats are fine, and if there's a hyper-aggressive tempo Mage deck that wants like a Cold Light Oracle with good stats, because that's really what this is, then this might actually see a decent amount of play. It's going to be definitely a frustrating card to play with and against if it's good enough that you're going to be seeing a lot of it, because you know, if they just get like a swipe or something and you get like Sacrificial Pact or something weak, it's just going to be very frustrating to play a card like this. But in most cases, I think that as long as your deck is like faster than your opponents, you have a lower curve, you're going to be getting better value off of getting that extra card compared to your opponent. Because most of the time, a random spell is going to be worse than the average card in the deck that somebody, like, it's going to be worse than a card that somebody put in their deck on purpose. You know, I'd rather have the swipe in my Druid deck than a random spell from the game, because there's just a lot of bad spells. So because of that, I feel like even if you give your opponent the extra spell off of Spellslinger, they're not really going to necessarily want to use that spell over other cards that are already in their hand. So I don't think it will change the plays that your opponent makes until it gets to a point where both of you have like run out of cards in hand, and then they're going to play whatever spell they got. And they're going to be corner cases where the spell that they get is just nuts, and that's going to be a little frustrating, but overall it's not going to be too common. Personally, I think it's good enough. I think that a hyper-aggressive Tempo Mage deck definitely could see a lot of play moving forward. Effigy gives you like another good board control secret to put into play off of a Kirin Mage, so I'm excited for like a Kirin Spellslinger type of hyper-aggressive deck, and we'll see if it ends up being good enough. Next we have Flame Lance. I mean, it's Assassinate, but worse, and Assassinate doesn't see much play. Good card for Arena, I think. I wouldn't really play this in Constructed in most decks. Even in something like Fatigue Mage, I just don't think it would ever see play, because there's just better cards you can find room for, like Cone of Cold or whatever. They're just better in controlling strategies. In some corner cases, if you want like a third polymorph, if you're already playing 2 polymorph, like some control mages do, maybe you would play Flame Lance, but even then I think you just play like 1 big game hunter, and you should never need more than 3 effects like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that this card's pretty unplayable. In Magic, though, for what it's worth, with Flame Lance, there were a couple of cards like Stuffy Doll that basically damaged your opponent if you damaged the card. So there were also cards in Magic that were kind of similar to Flame Lance, like Shivan Meteor, and there's kind of a combo deck you can build where you damage your own creature, and then the damage goes to their face. I don't think that kind of creature exists yet, but if they add one, the card would still be bad. So too bad. Anyway. Moving on to Paladin, we got Tuskar Jouster. It's a really exciting card. Basically this week, or yesterday, as of when I'm recording this video, they released a bunch of anti-aggro cards, which really made me feel like maybe I'm like wrong about the metagame becoming faster and faster. Like every deck will become more efficient, but the anti-aggro tools might be so strong that you can just build like a deck that is resilient enough against Face Hunter so easily, like without sacrificing too much against control, that aggro maybe won't be that dominant. You know, if you're not forced to put things like Zombie Chow in your deck that are dead in control matchups, if you can play like a 5-mana 5/5 like this guy and have it be very strong against aggro, then it's just a great tool basically to just add to your deck. Because you don't want to play cards that only wreck like Face Hunter. You can't afford to put cards like that in your deck, but the cost of putting Tuskar Jouster in your deck is very low, because it's a 5-mana 5/5. Those are reasonable stats, you know. And if you happen to win the joust, then you're pretty well off against aggro. So this is the new joust mechanic basically. Both players reveal a minion in their deck, and if yours costs more, you win. So that means that if you're playing against like a low curve aggressive deck like Zoo or Hunter, the cost of their cards are going to be pretty low, and you're going to win the joust most of the time. So you know, it's a mechanic that definitely encourages slower gameplay, and I think that's a really creative way to do it. I'm really happy with Blizzard's design in this case. I think it's like a really elegant solution to just making sure people don't get run over too much by the quick decks. Moving on to, but anyway, Tuskar Jouster, is it good or not? I think it's pretty good. I think it will see play in a more controlling strategy, which I think will actually be really strong, because all the tools are pretty much there now. You just got to pick the right cards. And one of the new tools that I think is fantastic is Eodric the Pure. Eodric, I don't know how you pronounce it, but anyway, it's an old guy, and he's a 3/7, but his ability is pretty nuts. That's like... It's so powerful, honestly. On almost any board, it's so good at slowing the game down, and because of all the great healing that Paladin has, like Tuskar Jouster, Heal Bot if you want it, Lay on Hands, even Guardian of Kings is a good card. So because of cards like this, Eodric the Pure, like even if they have 5 minions out, and you know, you give them all 1 health, they can still hit you for 5, but you're gonna have so much healing that you can like take 5 a turn. It's not a big deal, and his stats are amazing. Like 7 health is a ton. Even if he dies or gets silenced, his ability already happened. He's gonna be killing the stuff off that he shrunk when he, after he comes into play. I think that Eodric will be a really important tool for Control Paladin moving forward, and I definitely think that it's a super powerful card. And between this and Aldor Peacekeepers, like, you have so many ways to just slow down aggro, but like still have cards like Aldor and Eodric. There's still like high impact and control matchups. It's still like removal plus a dude. So Control Paladin looks really strong moving forward. Like, there might be enough anti-aggro tools at this point, or maybe enough ways to slow the game down that you can avoid getting comboed to death. That's really the scary thing in the game, are decks like Patron, decks like Rogue, like Oil Rogue. Those are the kinds of things that would destroy a slow controlling deck like Paladin, but I feel like combo decks probably need to exist in the game, because if the anti-aggro tools are going to be this good, like Tuskar Jouster and Eodric, then it'll be too easy to build like a slow control deck that just beats everything. And I feel like combo decks kind of keep that in check. So it'll be like aggro, combo, and control, and it's kind of a triangle effect. But yeah, things like Patron are going to destroy the Eodric deck, so we'll see. Moving forward, we got Argent Lance. Reveal a minion in each deck. If yours costs more, gain durability. This card would be a lot more playable, I guess, if it could potentially get one more attack. But it would also be very frustrating and random. So I'm very glad that this is always to attack, because I don't like having random board control early in the game. Like, if this were to add one attack, you would have to, I don't know, like the right play would be to play it, but then like 20% of the time you'd lose the joust, and then all of a sudden you lose the game because you can't kill their 2/3. Anyway, is the card good? You can compare it to the Shaman weapon, the Axe. The Axe doesn't see play, but that card does have Overload. This might be a little bit better. I feel like, if there are a lot of 2-health minions being played in aggressive decks, then this is something that you can look into, but probably I would say that this won't see play over things like Minibot or Knife Juggler or Owls, but it's definitely not unplayable. There are metagames where you want to be playing Argent Lance for sure, but I think it would just be like too many weapons. With Mustard, True Silver, Coghammer, it's probably just not good enough, honestly. And aggro, it's kind of interesting too, but not really. It's just a 2/2 for 2. And maybe that's good enough though. Alright, moving on to Priest. We got Holy Champion. Whenever a character is healed, gain 2 attack. So this is like a Light Warden, but a lot bigger. I don't think it's good enough, but like, it does beat Shredder in a heads-up fight. 3/5 are pretty good stats. So there's some potential here. I do know that any time that Light Warden lives, like off of Light of Naru, you can do really crazy stuff with Circle of Healing and kind of like threaten lethal the turn after. So maybe I'm not evaluating this card correctly. Like, maybe instead of being a 3/5 that becomes a 5/5, maybe it's more like a 3/5 that threatens to hit them for like 11 damage the turn after. That's a very different kind of card. So it's something that we might see, like might end up seeing play, but it really just depends on the kinds of things that Priest gets in the set. And it's definitely the class that's going to need the most help, because Priest and Shaman are the two like classes that aren't really top tier playable right now. So we'll see. I'm really looking forward to the other Priest cards. This one is like fine, but it's just another dude, so I don't think it does anything too important for the deck. Alright, so moving on to Rogue, we got Shadowpan Cavalry. Combo, gain 3 attack, and it's a 3/7. It's interesting. I mean, even today when I try to build Rogue decks, I run into the problem of having too many 5-mana cards, because you really need Antique Healbot, because you're taking so much damage with your weapons, and Azure Drake is just too good not to play. Harrison Jones is just kind of broken, honestly, and I think it will be for a very long time. Because Harrison is like one of the lowest risk, highest reward tech cards that you can put in a deck. On top of that, sometimes I play Lotheb. I usually play Lotheb. So is there room for another 5-mana card? Is it better than any of those things? I think not. I think that this card kind of reminds me of Bane of Doom. And not because they do the same thing, but because in a vacuum they're both like slightly overpowered. They're like very good value, very good stats, But the thing is, they don't fulfill a specific role in any matchup, so it's hard to justify the deck slot. A card like Antique Keelbot, for example, yes, it's terrible against control, but if I don't put it in my deck, I cannot beat Hunter. So I have to play Antique Keelbot. Azure Drake, just probably better value than this. Something like Lotheb, if I don't have it in my deck, I just can't beat like the Rogue Mirror, or I can't beat Freeze Mage. So there are specific cards that are like good on their own in the 5-mana slot, but they also fulfill a specific role for a matchup. And because this card doesn't really do that, it's just a pile of stats, it's probably not going to be good enough. And the same thing for Bane of Doom. It's insane value on average. It's just nuts. But you can't play it because you need to find room for healing and removal and AoE and all these other cards that are more important. So if a card doesn't fulfill a specific role in helping you beat specific matchups, it's just probably not going to see as much play. Moving on, we got Burgle. Add 2 random class cards to your hand from your opponent's class. I've seen this artwork somewhere before, I don't know where. It's an interesting card. It's like, you know, you can make the comparison with Arcane Intellect. Obviously, it's worse. Getting random class cards is a lot worse than getting cards that are deliberately put in someone's deck. So, you know, it's not as good as Arcane Intellect. But Rogue hasn't really had, like, a card draw tool like this in a long time. It's a lot more mana efficient than something like Sprint. It lets you get full value off of preparation, even though it's like bad value. It's kind of interesting. I feel like Burgle like probably won't see play, but if Rogue is really in a position where it wants the extra card draw, it can probably find the space. I do think that things like Gnomish Inventor would see more play than Burgle though. Then we got Poison Blade. This card came out like right around the same time that I released the first set reviews, and I didn't actually review it because it wasn't in the like total cards revealed thing that I look at. So anyway, Poison Blade, complete garbage, worst card in the set. You could add like I don't know. You could cut the mana cost in half, and I don't think it would see play. This card is just not good in any way at all. I think most people are kind of understand that. It's just too slow to get going, and you know, you'd never play it over something like Assassin's Blade or Perdition Blade or really any kind of blade, because Poison Blade is probably the worst card in the set. I do think this is worse than the new Demon buffing card even, because there are 0 scenarios where I'd put this in my deck. Anyway, moving on, we got Anubarak. This guy just got revealed. He's 9 mana, 8/4, Death Rattle, return this to your hand, and summon a 4/4 Nerubian. I think it's probably just too bad. Like, it's a rogue only card, it's extremely slow, very weak to silence. Like, they can have Big Game Hunter, and then it's a 4/4. Like honestly, anything you do to this card, like 4 health is the least safe number of health you can have in Hearthstone, because it has like the highest percentage of things that kill it, basically. Anything that has 4 health is going to be killed by something that costs the same or less mana as it most of the time. Outside of the card like Totem Golem. That's like one exception, because it costs 2 mana. You know, 2 mana cards aren't usually going to deal 4. Anyway, yeah, it's just too slow, too expensive, too slow. Definitely won't see play, but it's kind of an interesting card, I guess. It's cool. Even in those really slow, grindy control mirrors, though, I don't think this would be very good. All right, so moving on to Shaman. Let's see if anything got revealed. Looks like we have Ancestral Knowledge as the only card that's new. But it's a pretty cool one. 2 mana, draw 2 cards, Overload 2. If it was Overload 1, I would definitely say that it's amazing, but Overload 2 is a really high cost. Cards like Lava Shock are honestly just not good, because they don't get enough value on their own. So I feel like Ancestral Knowledge in a hyper-aggressive Shaman deck that's just looking to draw burn, it could be strong, but in most cases, Overload 2 is that's a big drawback. Like, it's a very scary card to play in a lot of cases, and I feel like as a Shaman, it's really important to play things like Fire Elemental or Dr. Boom on curve. So yeah, because of that, like it's so weird because I don't know what the shaman decks are gonna look like. I think they're gonna play the good value totem cards and just be like mid-rangey. But I also think that decks like Mech Shaman will still exist that are hyper aggressive, and they're just gonna like put Totem Golem in them. In a more aggressive list like the Mech Shamans that we have now, this could be really strong because those decks are really powerful, honestly. They're just a couple cards short, like 1-2 drop short of being good. And once Mech Shaman gets to play Totem Golem, the entire game changes. So in hyper-aggressive decks, this is going to be better, but I think in your mid-rangey, slower Shaman decks, you're not going to want to play Ancestral Knowledge. And this card existing won't really change how good Lava Shock is. Like, I don't think you'll want to start playing Lava Shock just because of this, unless there's randomly a lot of 2-health minions going around. But, yeah. Anyway, moving on to Warlock, we got Demon Fuse. A lot of people are complaining about this card, saying it's pretty terrible. Like, it's bad, don't get me wrong, but it's not as bad as it looks. Like, if it were to give +4/+4, I actually think it would be a little too good. So, yeah, the drawback is too big for what it does right now, but it's not, like, as bad as you think it is. I've played a lot of Rampage in my decks lately, and it's a very impressive card. It's a very powerful card. Getting a pile of stats like this is huge. And the fact that Warlock has access to, like, Mistress of Pain, Imp Gang Boss, like, it's really strong. Your opponent can't react. Like, you can take your whole turn before your opponent can react to it. So you get to play Demon Fuse on a full health minion, kill whatever you want. Your minion's still a huge threat, and they have to deal with it. It's not a card I'm saying you should like play turn 2, but in the mid game it's not the absolute worst. And if there's a hyper aggressive demon type of deck moving forward, I actually think this could see a lot of play, but it's not a lot of play. But it's definitely not as bad as people think it is. Like, it's almost playable, honestly. If the drawback was less big or it gave +1/+1 extra, I think it would be a very different story. So moving on to Wilfred Fizzlebang. It's a 6-mana 4/4. Cards you draw from your hero power cost 0. So with Emperor Thorson, it's like 7 mana. If you curve Emperor Thorson on turn 6 into Wilfred Fizzlebang on turn 7, you can play him life tap and play your card. But I think that's too slow. If there's a really controlling, like, slow Warlock deck, which are already starting to pop up, believe it or not, like, pure control Warlock is a thing. And then a card like this could actually be pretty strong. It's definitely a powerful effect. Keeping, like, again, 4 health is really sketchy, but it's you get so much value off of just like the first activation that it's definitely a card worth thinking about. I do feel like you have to life tap twice for it to be really good, so maybe that's just too hard to make work to want to fit in your deck in the first place, because it is competing with things like Sylvanas, Emperor, Dr. Boom, Cro-Magus even, pretty good in Warlock, and I think in a lot of cases in a slower Warlock deck that would be better than Wilfred. But it is a powerful card. Like, it might see more play than I think it will, and it's definitely better than the Rogue Legendary, and it's probably better than the Druid Legendary. So we'll see. Then we got Wrathguard. Honestly, 4/3 is not as good of stats as you'd think it is. Succubus, for example, doesn't really have that big of a drawback compared to what it looks like. But that's a card I never even put in Zoo. I tested it, but it was bad in Zoo, like even before Naxxramas came out. Before we had Rubian Egg, before we had Haunted Creeper. So like a 2-mana 4/3, it's just not that good of stats. 2-mana 3/4 is broken, but a 2-mana 4/3 is not that good of stats. The interesting thing about it is its ability isn't always a drawback. The first like week that I had the Hearthstone beta, maybe like a year and a half ago, the first Zoo deck that my friend and I tried building did actually play double Molten Giant in our an aggressive Warlock deck, and it's something that I've played a few times since then. I've streamed it a few times. I was in Shanghai for the NEL tournament, and I actually played Molten Giant Zoo in a tournament setting. I played like Sun Fury as a 2-drop in my aggro deck, and I had Moltens in it, and I was playing things like Pit Lord. So in a deck like that, this is actually really strong, just as like another hyper-aggressive card that helps you damage yourself. So it might see play for that reason. If you play a 1-drop beforehand, it's going to be a lot easier to protect your Wrath Guard, and it hits really hard. But dying to every single removal spell is definitely a pretty big drawback. We'll see. It's costed aggressively enough that it can see play, and I'm gonna try it in Molten Giant Zoo for sure. So Warrior got Bash, deal 3 damage, gain 3 armor. This is a card that a lot of other classes would have liked, but Warrior already has a really good amount of like removal, especially early game. I feel like Bash existing is going to make the 3-mana Warrior weapon that I'm going to talk about a lot less good, because in most cases you'd rather play this card just so you don't draw too many weapons. But this is a metagame reliant card. Like, if there are a bunch of control decks going around, you're not going to want to spend 3 mana dealing 3 damage to something. It's just too weak as far as card efficiency. Like, you'll empty your hand if you play crap like this. On the other hand, if something like Mech gets really popular, this card is absurd. Like, you'll want it every opening hand. War Axe into Bash just makes it impossible to lose the board early, and it's very strong in situations like that. So it's playable, but I don't think that Warrior is the class that really needed this kind of card. And I feel like most of the time I'd rather play something like Slam over Bash. So I don't think you'll see that much play unless the metagame's very aggressive. Moving on, we have King's Defender. This is the weapon I was talking about. So it's a 3-mana 3/2, and if you have a minion with Taunt, you gain 1 durability. So 3 attack is pretty important on a 3-mana weapon, because it's going to allow you to kill pretty much any 2-drop that came down before it. It kills most 3-drops. Really, I was thinking of playing like 1 King's Defender as like a 5th weapon, maybe for those games where you really want War Axe, but you don't draw your War Axe, then you can play King's Defender. But now that Bash is a card, you would rather just play the card that deals 3 damage and gains you 3 armor, because then you're not going to overload your hand with weapons. But it's another tool for very aggressive warrior decks. It's kind of strong with Dread Corsair, sort of. You have to play Corsair, attack with the weapon you had, play King's Defender after. I don't think it'll see too much play, but we're finally at that point where we have so many good weapon choices that it's not like we'll draw. It's not like we can play all our weapons and have it be okay anymore. There's actually a drawback now to putting too many good weapons in your deck, which hasn't really existed before. So yeah, for aggro warrior, I might try to make the deck that's like 16 weapons, just see what happens, but I don't think it'll see too much play. Moving on, we got Bolster. It's another card that rewards you for playing minions with Taunt in your warrior deck. Give your Taunt minions +2/+2. I mean, I think you have to have at least 2 Taunt minions for this to be good enough, and that just seems unlikely. In most cases, as a warrior, you're going to have, almost with any class, you're only going to have 1 relevant minion in play at a time. And then, you'll just keep trading those minions off. So, really late game, it could be good, but, I might just rather have, a Slam in the super late game. But it's interesting that it's another card that rewards Dread Corsair and Warrior. So, maybe that's a card that starts seeing a lot of play if there's even more cards that reward you for having taunts. And maybe if there is a really good warrior taunt in the set, this is something that could end up seeing a good amount of play. And moving on to neutral, we got a Coliseum Manager, 3-mana 2/5, Inspire, return it to your hand. It's an interesting effect. Maybe once more cards get revealed,